The Ego's Final Dance, a spiritual nonfiction audiobook, by David Russo. There comes a moment when the ego's final dance begins, not in public, not on stage, but inside the quiet collapse of everything you thought you were. The ego's final dance is subtle at first, just a loosening of certainty, a fading of control, a crack in identity. And if you watch closely, you will see it clearly. The ego is not dying violently, it is performing its final dance. Welcome to the ego's final dance. Introduction: the ego's final dance. There comes a moment in every human life when the noise begins to thin, not all at once, not with some dramatic collapse or visible tragedy, but quietly, almost invisibly, a moment when the identity you spent years building no longer fits as tightly as it once did. The ambitions still speak, but they no longer sound convincing. The roles still exist, but they begin to feel strangely distant. The mind still searches for certainty, approval, control, but beneath all of it, something deeper begins to awaken, and this awakening marks the beginning of the ego's final dance. This audiobook is not about destroying the ego. It is not about becoming someone spiritually superior, detached, or enlightened in the way the world imagines enlightenment. It is about seeing clearly, seeing the mechanism of identity, seeing the endless performance of the conditioned self, seeing the voice in the mind that constantly says, "This is who I am, this is what I need, this is what must happen for me to be whole." For most of life, that voice is never questioned. It becomes the center of experience, the invisible narrator behind every fear, every desire, every comparison, every conflict. And yet, if you observe carefully, you may begin to notice something extraordinary. The voice is being heard, which means it cannot be who you truly are. The ego survives through unconscious identification. It feeds on labels, memories, personal stories, and psychological attachment. It builds an identity out of success and failure, out of praise and rejection, out of pain and pleasure, out of everything temporary, and then it spends an entire lifetime defending what was never stable to begin with. This defense is the ego's dance, a constant movement of becoming, trying to be more, trying to avoid less, trying to secure permanence in a world where everything changes. But eventually, something shifts, perhaps through suffering, perhaps through silence, perhaps through exhaustion, perhaps through a sudden glimpse of stillness in the middle of ordinary life. The dance begins to slow, and for the first time, awareness steps back from the performance. You begin noticing the patterns instead of automatically becoming them. You see how the mind creates conflict, how identity creates separation, how attachment creates fear, and in that seeing, the ego starts losing its power, not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer fully believed. This is the heart of the ego's final dance, a journey beyond the false center you were taught to call yourself, a journey into presence, into stillness, into the silent awareness that exists before thought, beneath identity, and beyond fear. Because when the ego's final dance finally ends, something unexpected remains. Not emptiness, not annihilation, but freedom, a quiet and unshakable recognition that what you truly are was never trapped inside the dance at all. Chapter 1: The beginning of the ego's final dance. The ego's final dance does not begin when your life collapses. It begins much earlier. It begins the moment you start noticing the performance. For most of human life, the ego operates unnoticed. Its movements are automatic, rehearsed through years of conditioning and repetition. It speaks through your preferences, your fears, your ambitions, your reactions. It creates a version of yourself and then quietly convinces you to protect it at all costs. You call it me. But the beginning of the ego's final dance happens when a small distance appears between awareness and identity. For the first time, you notice the voice in your mind instead of immediately obeying it. You notice how quickly you defend your opinions, how deeply you crave recognition, how uncomfortable you become when ignored, criticized, or uncertain. You begin seeing the invisible performance that has been running your entire life. The ego wants to appear important, certain, in control, special, safe, and it constantly reshapes itself depending on the situation. Around some people, it becomes confidence. Around others, insecurity. Sometimes it performs superiority, sometimes victimhood, sometimes success, sometimes suffering, but beneath every role exists the same hidden fear, the fear of not existing. This is why the ego fights so hard to maintain identity, not because identity is real, but because the ego depends on belief to survive. And yet something changes when awareness enters the pattern. The moment you observe anger without becoming anger, observe fear without becoming fear, observe thought without becoming thought, the dance begins to weaken. This does not happen instantly. The ego does not disappear simply because it has been seen. In fact, the first stage of the ego's final dance is often subtle resistance. The mind becomes louder, more defensive, more restless. Old emotional patterns intensify. You may feel the urge to prove yourself more than before, to control situations more tightly, to seek distraction, validation, or certainty with greater urgency. This is because the ego senses what is happening. Its authority is being questioned. For the first time, awareness is no longer completely hypnotized by the performance, and this realization can feel deeply uncomfortable, because once you begin seeing the false self, you cannot fully return to unconsciousness. The masks become visible. You notice how often people speak from conditioning rather than presence. How much of conversation is performance? How much of personal identity is inherited from culture, family, memory, and fear? Even your own personality begins to feel less solid than you once believed, and this can create confusion. If the identity is unstable, if thoughts constantly change, if emotions rise and fall like weather, then what remains? This question marks the true beginning of the ego's final dance, not as a philosophy, not as an idea, but as direct experience. Because the awakening process does not begin by gaining something new, it begins by seeing through what was never truly you. And once this seeing begins, the dance can never fully return to the way it was before. Chapter 2. The Costume of the Ego. Every ego wears a costume. Some costumes are obvious: success, status, intelligence, beauty, achievement. Others are harder to detect: the wounded person, the misunderstood one, the helper, the seeker, the one who sacrifices everything for others. But regardless of its appearance, the costume serves the same purpose: to create a sense of self that feels solid enough to survive in an uncertain world. From childhood, the costume begins forming quietly. You are given names, expectations, labels, beliefs. You learn what earns love, what gains approval, what creates rejection. Slowly, identity is stitched together from experience, and over time, the costume becomes so familiar that you stop noticing you are wearing it. You simply call it who I am. But the ego's final dance begins exposing something uncomfortable. The costume is not the self. It is only the image the mind constructed in response to life. This realization can feel deeply unsettling, because the ego depends entirely on identification. It survives by attaching awareness to form, to personality, to history, to appearance, to success, to suffering. Even pain can become part of the costume. Many people unknowingly build identities around their wounds. Their suffering becomes their story becomes their identity, and their identity becomes something they fear losing, because without the costume, the ego does not know who it is. This is why the ego resists awakening, not because awakening destroys life, but because it reveals that the false self was never stable to begin with. The ego wants permanence in a temporary world. It wants certainty in a reality that constantly changes. So, it keeps adjusting the costume. When praised, it expands. When criticized, it contracts. When threatened, it defends itself. When ignored, it searches desperately for attention. And yet beneath all these movements, something silent continues watching. Awareness itself, the part of you that notices thought, notices emotion, notices reaction, notices identity. This awareness does not need the costume to exist. It was present before every label you acquired, before your achievements, before your failures, before the world told you who you were supposed to become. And this is what makes the ego uncomfortable, because awareness begins to reveal the difference between authenticity and performance. You start noticing how often your actions are motivated by image rather than truth, how much energy is spent maintaining appearances, how exhausting it becomes to constantly protect an identity that is always vulnerable to change. The ego fears exposure because exposure threatens the costume. But awakening is not humiliation. It is liberation from pretending. For perhaps the first time, you begin sensing the possibility that you do not need to perform existence. You do not need to constantly prove your value, defend your identity, or maintain an image in the minds of others. The costume may still appear, the personality may still function, but something fundamental begins shifting. You no longer confuse the mask for the face, and this recognition changes everything, because the ego's final dance is not the destruction of personality. It is the ending of unconscious attachment to the costume, the realization that what you truly are cannot be reduced to any role, label, memory, or identity the mind creates. The costume was never the problem, only the belief that it was you. Chapter 3. Control in the ego's final dance. Control is one of the ego's oldest survival strategies. It believes that if life can be managed carefully enough, pain can be avoided. If people behave the right way, if outcomes unfold according to plan, if the future remains predictable, then the self can finally feel safe. But the ego's final dance reveals a difficult truth. Life has never truly been under your control. Only your attachment to control has been. The ego fears uncertainty because uncertainty threatens identity. It wants guarantees, certainty, permanent ground beneath constantly shifting circumstances. So, it creates endless mental strategies to defend itself from the unknown. It controls conversations, controls appearances, controls emotions, controls relationships, controls time, controls the future through endless thinking. Even spirituality can become another form of control. The ego may try to control awakening itself, trying to become more enlightened, more peaceful, more evolved than others. But underneath every attempt at control exists the same hidden movement: fear, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of death, fear of dissolving into the unknown. And because the ego cannot tolerate uncertainty, it mistakes control for survival. This is why so much human suffering comes not from life itself, but from resistance to life. Reality moves one way, the ego demands another, and the tension between the two creates psychological struggle. You can feel this struggle whenever reality refuses to obey your expectations. A relationship changes, a plan falls apart, a career shifts unexpectedly, a person leaves, the body ages, the future becomes unclear. Immediately, the ego reacts, it tightens, it searches for someone to blame, something to fix, some way to regain control over what was never truly controllable. This tightening is part of the ego's final dance. The more unstable life becomes, the harder the ego performs. But awareness begins changing your relationship with this pattern. You start noticing the exhausting nature of constant resistance. You see how much energy is spent trying to force life into mental structures that cannot hold it. And slowly, something remarkable begins happening. Not passivity, not helplessness, but surrender. True surrender is not giving up on life. It is giving up the illusion that the ego was ever capable of controlling existence itself. You still act, you still choose, you still participate in life. But internally, the desperate need to control every outcome begins softening. You stop arguing with reality quite as much, and in that softening, space appears. A different kind of intelligence emerges, one not rooted in fear, but in presence, because life functions with, or without the ego's constant interference. The heart beats without control, breath moves without control, the earth spins without control, existence unfolds on its own. The ego calls this terrifying, awareness calls it freedom. For the first time, you begin realizing that peace was never hidden inside perfect control. Peace appears when the compulsion to control begins dissolving, and this is why control becomes one of the final movements in the ego's final dance, because the ego cannot survive without constantly trying to shape reality into a form that protects its identity. But reality was never designed to obey identity. Life moves beyond the mind's demands, and when this truth is deeply accepted, the dance begins slowing on its own, not through force, but through recognition that the controller itself was only another movement of the ego. Chapter 4. Identity Breakdown. There comes a stage in the ego's final dance when the identities you once depended on begin to lose their weight. Not suddenly, but gradually. like old walls cracking beneath pressure they can no longer hold. The roles that once gave you certainty begin feeling strangely hollow. The successful person, the strong person, the intelligent person, the spiritual person, the wounded person, even the identities you fought hard to protect start feeling unstable. And this can be frightening, because the ego builds its entire existence around identity. It defines itself through labels, achievements, relationships, beliefs, nationality, status, appearance, memory, and personal history. It constantly asks, who am I in relation to others? What makes me valuable? How should I be seen? But during identity breakdown, these answers stop satisfying the mind in the way they once did. The external structures remain, yet internally something begins dissolving. You may still carry the same name, still live in the same world, still perform the same responsibilities, but inwardly, the sense of being a fixed and separate self starts weakening, and the ego interprets this as danger, because without identity, it no longer knows how to define itself. This is why identity breakdown is often misunderstood as failure, confusion, or crisis. But spiritually, something much deeper is happening. Awareness is beginning to separate from the structures it once unconsciously inhabited. You begin noticing how fluid identity actually is, how personality changes depending on environment, how beliefs evolve over time, how emotions rise and disappear, how even your self-image shifts constantly based on experience. The person you were 10 years ago is gone. The person you were yesterday is already fading. Yet something has remained present through every change. Something aware, something untouched by the constant movement of identity. This realization creates a profound question. If everything I can observe about myself changes, then what is it that remains? The ego cannot answer this directly, because the ego itself is part of what is being observed. Thoughts are observed. Emotions are observed. Roles are observed. Fear is observed. Even the sense of me becomes observable, and this observation changes everything. For the first time, you begin sensing that identity may not be the core of who you are. It may only be a temporary expression appearing within awareness. This does not mean your personality disappears. The human character continues functioning. You still speak, work, love, create, experience life. But internally, attachment begins loosening. You no longer need every label to define your existence. You stop clinging so tightly to personal narratives. The mind may still produce identities, but awareness is no longer completely trapped inside them. And with this loosening often comes grief, because identity breakdown can feel like losing parts of yourself you spent years building. The ego mourns the collapse of certainty. It mourns the loss of psychological structure. But beneath that grief, something quieter begins emerging. Freedom from performance, freedom from constant self-construction, freedom from carrying the exhausting burden of maintaining a fixed image in a changing world. This is why identity breakdown is not the end of your life. It is the end of unconscious identification. The ego calls this emptiness, but awareness recognizes it as space. Space for something more honest, more alive, more real than identity could ever become. Because the ego's final dance reaches a turning point the moment you realize you are not the story the mind keeps repeating. You are the awareness witnessing the story unfold. Chapter 5. Suffering as the turning point. There is a reason suffering changes people. Not always outwardly, but inwardly. Something begins to crack open when life no longer follows the script the ego expected. The ego spends years creating an image of how life should unfold. It imagines the future, builds identities around success and security, searches for love, recognition, certainty, and permanence. And for a while, this pursuit creates the illusion of stability. But eventually, life interrupts the performance. A relationship ends unexpectedly. A loss arrives without warning. A dream collapses. The body weakens. Loneliness appears. Anxiety enters quietly in the middle of ordinary days. And suddenly, the ego realizes something it has spent an entire lifetime avoiding. It cannot control reality. This is why suffering becomes such a powerful turning point in the ego's final dance, because suffering exposes the limits of the false self. The ego believes it can think its way to permanent safety, control its way to peace, achieve its way to wholeness. But suffering reveals the instability beneath those attempts. What the ego calls my life is constantly changing. People change, circumstances change, thoughts change, emotions change, the body changes. Nothing remains fixed long enough for the ego to secure permanent identity inside it. And this realization can feel devastating at first. The mind reacts immediately. It searches for escape, distraction, blame, solutions, anything to avoid fully feeling the discomfort of uncertainty. But there comes a moment in deep suffering when distraction no longer works the way it once did. The old patterns lose their ability to numb the inner tension. And in that moment, awareness has an opportunity to emerge. Not through force, not through spiritual effort, but through exhaustion. The exhaustion of endlessly resisting reality. You begin noticing how much suffering comes not only from pain itself, but from the mind's refusal to accept what already exists. The ego says, "This should not be happening. This cannot be my life. I need things to return to the way they were." And this resistance creates psychological conflict. Reality moves one way. The ego demands another. This tension becomes suffering. But as awareness deepens, something extraordinary begins happening. You start witnessing pain without completely becoming it. You notice grief moving through you, fear moving through you, sadness moving through you. Yet beneath these experiences, something remains present and aware. Stillness. The discovery of this stillness changes your relationship with suffering forever, because for the first time, you realize that awareness itself is untouched by the storm passing through the mind. This does not mean human pain disappears. The heart still feels loss. The body still experiences difficulty. Life still changes in unpredictable ways. But suffering is no longer automatically transformed into identity. You stop saying, "This pain is who I am," and instead, you begin recognizing, "This pain is an experience appearing within awareness." This is the hidden transformation suffering offers during the ego's final dance. It breaks the illusion that control can save you. It weakens attachment to false identity. It forces attention inward towards something deeper than thought. And slowly, through the cracks created by suffering, presence begins entering your life, not as an idea, not as philosophy, but as direct experience. Because sometimes suffering is not the punishment the ego believes it to be. Sometimes it is the doorway through which awareness finally enters the room. Chapter 6. The silence in the ego's final dance. As the ego's final dance continues, something subtle begins to change within you. The mind is still active. Thoughts still appear. Memories still arise. Emotions still move through the body. But they no longer carry the same authority they once did. For most of life, thought feels absolute. Every mental story appears true the moment it enters awareness. The ego depends on this unconscious identification. It survives by keeping attention completely absorbed in thought. Constant commentary, constant judgment, constant interpretation. The mind speaks endlessly about the past, about the future, about yourself, about others, about what should happen and what should not. And because the ego fears silence, it fills nearly every moment with psychological noise. Even when the external world becomes quiet, internal movement continues. Planning, remembering, comparing, regretting, imagining. The ego believes this endless thinking is necessary for survival. But during the ego's final dance, awareness begins noticing something extraordinary. Thought is happening by itself. You are not consciously creating each thought. They simply arise, one after another, like clouds passing through an open sky. And once this becomes visible, a small space begins appearing between awareness and the mind. For the first time, you notice thought instead of immediately becoming trapped inside it. This changes everything, because the ego loses power the moment thoughts are observed without automatic belief. You begin realizing that not every thought deserves obedience. Not every fear is truth. Not every mental story reflects reality. Not every judgment defines who you are. And in this observation, silence begins emerging. Not forced silence, not the silence of suppression, but natural silence, a stillness that was always present beneath the noise of the mind. At first, these moments may appear only briefly, perhaps while watching the sky, listening to rain, sitting alone in the early morning, walking without distraction. For a few seconds, thought stops pulling your attention completely into itself, and what remains feels strangely familiar, open, peaceful, alive. This silence is not emptiness. It is awareness without mental interference. The ego often fears this experience because silence threatens its existence. Without constant thought, identity begins weakening. The mental narrative loses momentum, and the false self no longer remains at the center of experience. This is why many people unconsciously avoid silence. They keep themselves occupied at all times. Noise becomes protection. Distraction becomes escape. Because in silence, the ego cannot perform as easily, but eventually, awareness becomes strong enough to remain present even when the mind continues speaking. Thoughts still arise, yet they are no longer the unquestioned ruler of your inner world. You begin experiencing life more directly. A simple breath becomes noticeable. A moment of stillness becomes meaningful. Ordinary existence begins feeling complete without constant mental commentary. And slowly, the ego starts losing its audience. The mind may continue performing its dance, offering fears, opinions, desires, and stories, but awareness no longer clings to every movement. This is the deeper transformation happening in the ego's final dance, not the destruction of thought, but freedom from total identification with it. Because silence reveals something the ego never fully understood. You are never the voice inside the mind. You are the awareness listening to it all along. Chapter 7. The Death of Comparison. Comparison is one of the ego's most persistent habits. Almost invisible at first, it quietly shapes the way the mind experiences reality. From childhood, you are taught to measure yourself against others. Who is smarter, more successful, more attractive, more admired, more spiritual, more important? The ego builds identity through contrast. It needs someone beneath it to feel superior, someone above it to feel incomplete. Without comparison, the false self struggles to define itself. This is why the ego constantly watches the lives of others. It searches for evidence to confirm its value or reinforce its insecurity. Even moments of achievement rarely bring lasting peace, because the ego immediately shifts the standard. There is always someone with more, someone ahead, someone who appears happier, wiser, richer, more fulfilled. The comparison never ends because the ego survives through dissatisfaction. It feeds on the feeling that something is missing, and in the ego's final dance, this pattern becomes painfully visible. You begin noticing how much mental energy is spent measuring yourself against illusions, not reality but mental images, projected identities, curated appearances, personal assumptions. The mind compares your internal struggles to the external image of someone else's life, and from this comparison, suffering is born. Jealousy, shame, pride, inferiority, superiority, different expressions of the same illusion, the belief in separation. The ego says, I am this, and they are that. But awareness begins seeing through the structure itself. You start recognizing that comparison only exists when identity feels incomplete. The more attached you are to a mental image of yourself, the more threatened you become by the success, beauty, intelligence, or recognition of others, because the ego interprets another person's light as a reduction of its own. But awareness does not function this way. Awareness does not compete. The sky does not compare itself to the ocean. The mountains do not envy the stars. Existence expresses itself differently through all forms without conflict, and slowly, you begin sensing this truth within yourself. Life is no longer experienced as a race for psychological validation. The desperate need to become more starts weakening, not because ambition disappears, but because your worth is no longer tied to comparison. This creates an entirely different relationship with other people. You stop seeing them primarily as threats, rivals, or mirrors for your insecurity. Instead, you begin recognizing shared humanity beneath the costumes of identity. Everyone is carrying fear. Everyone is seeking peace. Everyone is trying to escape suffering in their own way. And this recognition softens the mind. Compassion begins replacing judgment. Presence replaces competition. The ego may still attempt comparison from time to time. Old conditioning does not vanish instantly. The mind may still whisper, "You are behind. You are not enough. You should be somewhere else by now." But awareness hears these thoughts differently now. They are no longer absolute truth, only echoes of conditioning, and with each moment of conscious observation, the pattern loses strength. Because comparison cannot survive in deep presence, The moment you fully enter this moment without mentally measuring yourself against another, life, the ego's rhythm begins dissolving. There is no better in simple awareness, no worse, no hierarchy of being, only life expressing itself as it is. This is the death of comparison in the ego's final dance, not the destruction of individuality, but the ending of psychological separation created by the mind, the realization that your existence never needed comparison to have value, because awareness itself is already whole before the ego begins measuring it. Chapter 8. Presence emerging. When the ego's final dance begins to slow, something quietly takes its place. It does not arrive like a thought. It does not announce itself. It is not something you achieve, acquire, or understand intellectually. It is something you notice when everything unnecessary begins falling away. Presence. At first, it may appear only in brief moments, a pause between thoughts, a silence after an emotional reaction, a stillness beneath ordinary activity. You might not even recognize it as anything special. It feels simple, almost as simple to notice. Yet it is unlike anything the thinking mind can produce, because presence is not a concept. It is direct experience before interpretation, before the mind names it, before identity claims it, before memory turns it into a story. In presence, there is no psychological distance between you and what is happening. Life is no longer filtered through constant commentary. The mind is still there, but it is no longer dominating experience. Thoughts may arise, but they are no longer the center of gravity. Instead, awareness itself becomes primary, and in this shift, something profound is revealed. You are not inside life observing it from a distance. You are the space in which life is appearing. This recognition cannot be fully captured in language, because language belongs to thought. Presence exists before thought. That is why it feels so immediate, so alive, so ungraspable. There is no effort in it, no becoming, no striving, only being. Breathing happens, sounds are heard, sensations move through the body, yet there is no separate thinker constantly labeling and dividing experience into fragments. Time feels different in presence. The mind may still refer to past and future, but they lose their dominance. Attention rests naturally in what is here, and what is here is always enough. This is why presence often feels peaceful, even when circumstances are not, because peace in presence is not dependent on conditions. It does not arise from external perfection. It arises from the absence of resistance. The ego resists what is. Presence allows what is, and in that allowance, a natural clarity emerges. You begin responding to life rather than reacting from conditioned thought. Actions become simpler, more direct, less burdened by mental noise. Even ordinary moments, walking, listening, speaking, resting, begin to feel more real, not intensified in a dramatic way, but clarified, like dust settling in water, revealing what was already there beneath the disturbance. As presence deepens, you start noticing how much energy was previously consumed by unnecessary mental activity, endless analysis, endless self-definition, endless internal commentary, and without it, something unexpected appears. Ease, not the absence of challenges in life, but the absence of constant psychological struggle against life. The ego may still attempt to reassert itself. It may return through thought, memory, or emotion, but now it is seen more clearly. It no longer fully captures awareness, because presence has been recognized, and once recognized, it cannot be fully forgotten again. This is the beginning of a new relationship with existence, not as something to control, not as something to escape, not as something to become, but as something to be fully present with. And in the ego's final dance, presence is not another stage to reach. It is what remains when the need to reach anything at all begins to dissolve. Chapter 9. Not knowing in the ego's final dance. The ego is built on knowing, or more precisely, on the illusion of knowing. It wants answers, explanations, certainty about the future, definitions for the self, clear interpretations for every experience. Even when life is uncertain, the ego rushes in to fill the gap with thought. It would rather believe a story than remain in uncertainty, because not knowing feels unsafe to the ego. Not knowing threatens its sense of control, identity, and direction. So, it constantly constructs meaning. This is what is happening. This is who I am. This is what will happen next. This is good. This is bad. This is right. This is wrong. The mind rarely rests in openness. It prefers conclusions, even if they are false. But in the ego's last dance, something begins to shift. Life starts exposing the limits of certainty. Plans fail. Outcomes change. People behave unexpectedly. Emotions arise without explanation. The future refuses to be fully predicted. And slowly, the mind begins to lose its grip on fixed understanding. At first, this feels unsettling, because the ego interprets uncertainty as danger. It believes, if I do not know, I cannot be safe. So it tries harder to know. It analyzes more, thinks more, controls more, predicts more. But life continues to remain unpredictable, and eventually, exhaustion sets in. Not physical exhaustion alone, but psychological exhaustion, the fatigue of constantly trying to mentally secure what cannot be secured. In that exhaustion, something unexpected becomes possible. A different kind of intelligence begins to emerge, not the intelligence of accumulated knowledge, but the intelligence of presence, the ability to remain open without needing immediate answers. This is the beginning of not knowing in the ego's last dance. At first, not knowing feels like emptiness. The mind resists it. But if you stay with it, without rushing to fill it with concepts, something remarkable begins to reveal itself. Not knowing is not confusion. It is openness. It is space before conclusion. It is awareness without mental interference. In not knowing, the grip of identity begins to soften, because identity depends on definition, and definition depends on certainty. When certainty dissolves, identity becomes less rigid. You stop needing to define every moment immediately. You begin allowing experience to be what it is, without forcing it into a mental box. And in that allowance, clarity appears not as thought, but as direct seeing. You respond more naturally to life, rather than reacting from pre-existing assumptions. There is less internal conflict between reality and expectation, more willingness to meet each moment fresh. Not knowing does not mean ignorance. It means freedom from the compulsion to mentally control reality. It is a return to direct experience before interpretation, and as this deepens, something quietly transformative happens. You begin trusting life in a different way, not because everything becomes predictable, but because you are no longer relying on prediction for peace. The ego fears this state because it cannot dominate it. There is nothing solid for it to hold on to, no final answer to defend, no fixed identity to preserve. But awareness does not need certainty in the same way. It is already here, before certainty and uncertainty appear. And in this realization, not knowing becomes not a problem to solve, but a doorway out of the exhausting need to constantly understand everything, into the simple presence of experiencing life as it unfolds. And this is one of the deepest movements in the ego's final dance, the moment when you stop needing to know in order to be at peace. Chapter 10. The final movement of the ego's final dance. The ego does not end with a dramatic collapse. It does not explode. It does not disappear in a single moment of transformation. It does not leave behind a perfectly purified mind. Instead, it fades in a far quieter way. It is no longer fully believed. This is the final movement of the ego's last dance. For most of life, the ego feels like the center of experience. It speaks in the first person. It claims ownership of thoughts, emotions, memories, and actions. It constructs a continuous story called me, and that story feels real because it is constantly reinforced by attention. But as awareness deepens through presence, silence, suffering, identity break down, and the softening of comparison and control, something fundamental shifts. You begin to notice the ego as an activity rather than an identity. Thoughts still arise, but they are seen more clearly as thoughts. Emotions still appear, but they are no longer automatically translated into "this is who I am." The voice in the mind continues speaking, but it loses its authority. It becomes background noise instead of the center of existence. And in that shift, something extraordinary happens. The dancer is seen as the dance. The ego was never a solid entity. It was a movement of thought, memory, conditioning, and identification appearing in awareness. A performance that only seemed real because it was never questioned. But once it is seen clearly, its grip begins to loosen, not through force, not through rejection, but through recognition, and recognition changes everything, because what is seen clearly cannot maintain the same illusion of authority. The ego may still appear, it may still comment, react, and narrate experience, but it is no longer the ultimate reference point. You are no longer fully inside it. There is now a space around it, a quiet knowing that you are not the voice, but what is aware of the voice. You are not the thought, but what notices thought. You are not the story, but the awareness in which the story unfolds. This recognition does not destroy life. It clarifies it. Personality remains. Functioning continues. Daily life goes on. But something subtle is no longer there. The belief that the ego is who you truly are. And with that belief loosening, a deep simplicity emerges. Experience is no longer filtered through constant self-referencing. Not every moment is turned into identity. Not every emotion becomes a personal definition. Not every thought becomes truth. There is a growing intimacy with what is happening right now, unburdened by constant psychological interpretation. This is why the ego's last dance is not an ending of life, but an ending of illusion. The illusion of separation. The illusion of permanence in identity. The illusion of a fixed self controlling existence. And what remains when this illusion is no longer fully believed. Not a perfected version of the ego. Not a new identity. But awareness itself. Quiet, open, unnowned, present without effort. The ego's final dance was never the destruction of something real. It was the gradual seeing through of something imagined. And when the dance is finally seen for what it is, it no longer needs to continue in the same way. Not because something was defeated, but because nothing was ever truly separate from awareness to begin with. Conclusion: what remains after the dance? The ego's final dance was never about destroying something real. It was about seeing clearly what was never truly you. As this journey comes to its end, it is important to understand that nothing in ordinary life has been rejected. The world still exists. Thought still arises. Emotion still moves. Memory still appears. The human experience continues in its natural rhythm. But something subtle has changed in how it is all experienced. The center that once claimed ownership over everything has begun to dissolve. Not through effort, not through struggle, but through seeing. Seeing that the ego was never a solid entity only, a pattern of thought appearing in awareness.com, a voice that said I, a story that referred to itself as me, a constant attempt to define, control, and preserve identity in a changing world. And for most of life, that story went unquestioned. It felt like truth because it was familiar. But familiarity is not the same as reality. As awareness deepens, the identification with that story begins to loosen. And what becomes clear is this: you were never inside the ego. The ego was appearing inside you, inside awareness, inside the space in which all experience unfolds. This realization does not remove the human being from life. It removes the illusion of separation from life. There is still walking, still speaking, still working, still relating, still feeling, but the heavy psychological center, the constant need to define, defend, and maintain a fixed identity begins to fade. What remains is simpler, more immediate, more alive, presence without ownership, experience without constant interpretation, life without the burden of continuously becoming someone. And in this simplicity, there is a quiet freedom that cannot be fully described, because it is not something gained. It is something uncovered. It was always here, before the first thought of me, before the first story of identity, before the ego began its long performance of becoming. Awareness was already present, unchanging, unmoving, open, and everything the ego tried so hard to protect was only ever a movement within that awareness. So the ending of the ego's final dance is not an ending of life. It is the ending of misunderstanding, the misunderstanding that you were ever separate from what is happening now. And when that misunderstanding falls away, even briefly, life is no longer experienced as something happening to someone. It is simply happening, and you are that knowing space in which it all appears, not as an identity, not as a concept, but as the quiet fact of being aware. And in that recognition, there is nothing left to complete, nothing left to become, nothing left to escape, only this, already here, already whole, already free.